So what will we try to do today? It won't be a partisan talk. It won't even be, I would say, an ideological talk, but try to talk about a little bit about the vision of where healthcare is, what's wrong with it, where it's going to go, where it ought to go, and we'll see if we can find some interesting common ground to talk about. I'll look forward to the questions and answers. So I have just started at Mercatus. By way of background, I worked for trade association for the last 6 years. Before that, I was a professor at University of Richmond. Before that, the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond for 12 years. And before that, I was Chase Manhattan Bank's economist for Sub-Saharan Africa. So it's been sort of an interesting ride, and in some ways, all those pieces come together right now in what we're doing in healthcare. So Mercatus, I started there September 1st. Mercatus is at George Mason University. It is a research institution, and interestingly, over the past few years, it never really had a full-blown healthcare project. Had a few people who were excellent scholars who dabbled in healthcare now and then, sort of as a side line to what they usually do, but they never really had a healthcare program there. So I was asked to start one starting September 1st, and a lot of questions. A lot of people said, isn't this kind of an odd time to begin getting into healthcare policy? I mean, we went through multiple years of debate. The law was passed in 2010. It's well along the way. It's heading, scheduled for full implementation for the most part in 2014. And I would say actually, not only is it not an odd time to be starting a healthcare policy program, it's the best time. A lot of the arguments, a lot of the discussions in Washington are sort of locked into place. People have taken their positions. They have a stack of position papers this high, and it's sort of hard to get out from under what you've said over the last 5 to 10 years. Well, we have the ability to make a fresh start, to stake out some positions that don't quite sound like anyone else's, and that's the goal. So we really want to establish a program that people who may not agree with Mercatus on some things find some merit in this. Because I think healthcare really does, it ought to cut across lines that are somewhat different than other issues. Let me give you an example. I'm going to refer today, I haven't thought of better terminology yet, though it's it's on my punch list for this year. I'll refer to centralizers and decentralizers, by which I mean a centralizer wants to take the control over the healthcare system, sort of establish it here in Washington, to concentrate it, to bring in lots of experts to make decisions for the rest of the system. Decentralizer would be more toward leaving decisions to the individuals, to doctors, to states, to scatter the decisions about. Now, that may sound a lot like liberal and conservative, but I find that it really isn't. My students, my grad students, tend to be doctors, nurses, health administrators. They're mid-career people who have long experience. And I find that I get some in my classes who may be strong Republicans, free market types, who nevertheless will say, well, but on health care, I think that stuff doesn't work, so I'm all for Washington taking a grip over the system. Just as well, I have other people who are liberals, Democrats, who sort of take the position, well, on health care, I don't really want Washington messing around in my physician practice. I want between my patients and me. So it really cuts very strangely across the ideological lines in my classes, and that's actually one of the things I really like about it. So let me start with a story from about, well, first of all, let me say, if anyone is entirely comfortable with what I say, then I haven't done my job. I kind of hope to take a few barbs at everybody in every position that's out there. So how would I characterize the centralizers? I would say, in the case of the ACA, and I will spend some time pillaring the ACA, I'm not a fan of it, I would characterize that law and what led to it as something about gross overreach. On the other hand, I would say the opponents of the ACA, and I am an opponent of the ACA, but I would say opponents of the ACA I would characterize as very much disinterested underreach. Failure to come up with a workable set of policies that are an appropriate alternative to the ACA. So I tend to sort of blame both sides equally. I sat down to lunch. I like crossing the aisles and talking to people with whom I disagree, and I have a friend in town who's a well-known name in healthcare circles and a strong ACA backer. Back in 2011, we sat down over lunch, and it was while the lawsuit was heading toward the Supreme Court. And at the time, I was working for the association whose name appears atop the lawsuit. So we were talking, and I said, look, if I were you, I would go to bed every night with two fears on my mind. I said, the little fear is we win our lawsuit, the law will be struck from the books, and for the rest of your life, you're never going to have another opportunity to do it right. And he said, okay, what's the big fear? I said, we lose the lawsuit. And I was sort of envisioning what is happening now, only I will have to say the speed with which parts of the ACA have imploded are even a surprise to me. I think arguably, and I'm happy to talk about it, I think it may well end up being, despite the sort of attempts at cheerful news over the last week or so, I think it will end up being the greatest legislative catastrophe in U.S. history. I think it's going to be a serious problem, and I haven't talked to my friend about it, but I don't imagine he's happy at this point if I really could get him in a quiet room. That said, the ACA opponents, I would characterize the decentralizers, I would say have offered a very weak assortment of proposals that really aren't, and I'm going to stereotype, but I would say it's not really high on their agendas. They're not people who tend to walk into a room and say, let's talk about health care. Tends to be the last thing on earth they want to talk about. If a centralizer brings it up and wants to talk about it, they'll come up with a few sort of reflexive answers and then change the subject as quickly as possible to something they like talking about. So what are the alternatives that are often cited? And you'll see people waving the flag saying, you see, there are other bills out here, there are other proposals. And I always find, again, these are people with whom I'm often generally allied in many ways, but I don't know that they really strongly believe what they're pushing on this. So they'll say, well, we need to buy and sell insurance across state lines, and that's going to really do the trick. Well, I'm fine with buying and selling across state lines, actually. I think it's a perfectly fine idea, but I think it will do roughly as much good as buying and selling haircuts across state lines. Health insurance is an intensely local good, and quite frankly, no one in Nevada is going to come in and do a bang-up job and sell health insurance in Virginia or Maryland. It just doesn't work that way. It's different from life insurance, car insurance, where the variables are much simpler and can be monitored from a distance. So again, I'm perfectly fine. I favor the ability to sell across state lines. I don't think it'll actually do much. Malpractice. This tends to be a decentralizer talking point, that the real problem is jurisprudence, the cost of that, of litigation, of defensive medicine. So, okay, the best estimates we have out there are that malpractice, the problems of malpractice probably add about 2 to 5% to the cost of health care every year. If you could solve that problem in its entirety, that would get health care costs down to what they were in around February. I know of no one who is nostalgic about what was the state of healthcare prices back in February. So malpractice, and I'll come back to malpractice, it's an important issue, but not for that reason. Wellness initiatives, that kind of fits the decentralizer ethic. Personal responsibility, let's all be healthier, let's encourage that. Well, I'm all for that. Again, I'm for malpractice reform, I'm for wellness initiatives. However, wellness initiatives, by and large, will increase the cost of healthcare, not decrease. And it's quite paradoxical. I usually have to spend a couple of weeks shaking my students and getting them to understand why that is. And we can talk about it later if you like, but basically wellness initiatives increase the cost of healthcare, they don't decrease it. It's a good thing to do, but you got to pay for it. Transparency, post a few prices. The decentralizers tend to say, well, look at LASIK and look at plastic surgery. The prices are posted on the wall, they're great, they're wonderful, that's how it should work. And first of all, I would say there's a problem with that logic. Again, I agree, those are both interesting industries to watch that. But fundamentally, you have a difference in those in that no one ever dials 911 to get to their LASIK guy or to the plastic surgeon. Right? I don't know, some communities maybe plastic surgeon, yeah. But some zip codes. Transparency can cut both ways. Transparencies can, in a competitive market, can create downward pressures. In an oligopolistic market, they can actually have kind of the reverse effect, which is why antitrust law is filled with examples of you can't share your prices with your competitors, because if you do, we're sure you're going to actively or tacitly collude. But the other thing is, there's not much point about transparent prices if there's only one thing you can buy. And that's the problem. We have limited what we can buy and what we can't buy in healthcare, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. And then also on the decentralizer agenda is tax equalization. Equalize the tax treatment of buying it through your employer and buying it as an individual. Actually, that's the one I think that actually is quite important. I think creating that distinction, that difference, destroyed the individual tax market back in the 1940s. And I consider that to have been one of the most severe domestic policy failures of the 20th century. That alone caused our healthcare system to wander over to where it is. Now you can't unwander it simply by eliminating that, but that is an important step. So, not too thrilled with either side. But that's good, because it gives me a job and something to complain about and something to work on, thinking of new ideas, new approaches. Now it became, during the sales pitch for the ACA, it became a common phrase to say we need to bend the cost curve. You hear it all the time. You've been reading a debate in the papers on the web over the last week about whether the ACA has or has not bent the cost curve. The answer is simple, it hasn't, but that we can get onto that later. But I would say we don't need to bend the cost curve, we need to break it to bits. We need to shatter it. And I'll explain what that means. I've tried to make the iconic question in my writing over the last couple of months, why is it that healthcare has no Steve Jobs? Why? You can find equivalents to Steve Jobs or Bill Gates in aviation, manufacturing, agriculture, distribution, transportation, communication, finance, people who come in out of nowhere you've never heard of, who have no reputation in the business, who come into an industry, cause the prices to plummet, and cause the quality to increase incredibly. You think of the iPhone. Some of you, I'm sure, have an iPhone here. Costs what, $500? What you're holding in your pocket would have been the most powerful computer on Earth as recently as 1985. The CIA buying the supercomputers for millions and tens of millions of dollars would have been buying a machine that could do less than an iPhone can do today. That's something we call disruptive innovation. You take an old market, like the computer market, you completely disrupt it. You drive some people out of business, you bring new people in who you've never heard of into business, and you change the world with it. So let's go back. Let me ask, what should we be aspiring to do in healthcare? And I will take it back to basics. I wrote something recently, and I said, an ideal healthcare system will provide better health to more people at lower cost on a continuous basis. kind of a mouthful, so let me take it piece by piece because every piece is important. An ideal healthcare system. Ideal, this is something to aspire to. Probably not something you ever achieve, but something you aspire to. Will provide better health. I didn't say health insurance. I didn't say health care. There's a distinction. The purpose of this ought to be to make people healthier, not to put an insurance card in their pocket or to get them in front of a doctor doing something to them that doesn't necessarily improve their health. To more people, expand it. Coverage does matter. At lower cost. You know, we've been seeing prices soaring for decades and decades and decades. You don't get the sort of disruptive innovation that you see in computers. And on a continuous basis, which means we don't just get lower cost and better quality now and then when the government passes a law and says, we're going to do this now and it's done. It's got to be a process, something that happens day in, day out. So what happens when Steve Jobs and Bill Gates come into the computer market? 1965, every computer on Earth would have been the size of a room. Maybe not quite this big a room, but room size, and would have cost in the millions of dollars. By today's reckoning, probably tens of millions of dollars in today's dollars. And again, they weren't terribly powerful. I like to point out to my students that the Voyager spacecraft, which has now left the solar system, took magnificent pictures of the outer planets. The internal RAM of that computer was 64K. That's how far computers have come. Well, what we had at that point was we were, up till 1965, we were getting bigger computers for fewer people at higher cost and change only episodically. What happened with the disruptive innovation that starts really it starts in 1965 when a company called DEC, which you may never heard of for a good reason, DEC offered the first mini computer for $19,000. That was disruptive innovation. It didn't do as much as the mainframe, but you could get it for $19,000 instead of a couple million. And it changed the world. And lo and behold, within 10 years, DEC's gone because people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates came in and said, you know, you don't really need to spend $19,000. We can make one about this big for a couple thousand. And the world begins to change, and then cell phones and up to today's smartphones. And we got better computers for more people at lower cost on a continuous basis. Exactly what I think we need in healthcare, and we prevent that from happening. So if you took today's centralizers, decentralizers, and I'll say consumers of healthcare, and take their arguments and transplant the rhetoric on the computer market in 1965, the centralizers would have been saying, okay, computers are too expensive. Cheapest computer out there is $1 million. It's all because IBM is a for-profit enterprise, so what we need is the government to make computers, and the government will do it for $975,000, and that'll be great. And if they don't make them, at least they can buy all of them and distribute them. They can be a single-payer computer system, or regulate them or whatever. The decentralizers, using today's healthcare rhetoric, would have been saying, no, actually what we need is more reliance on the market. We need competition. So what we're going to do is we're going to open a mainframe computer store at every shopping mall. So you can go over here, you can go in Maryland or Virginia and buy your mainframe. And that'll get that price down from $1 million to $975,000. The businesses that buy computers would have been saying, no, what we're going to do is we're going to use our market power, the strength of us together, and we're going to tell IBM, we're not paying a cent more than $975,000, and that's it. Meanwhile, the centralizers, the decentralizers, and the business customers would have all gotten together and said, let's make real sure that no one can work in his garage and make a little computer about this big that costs $1,000 or $2,000. Let's make it illegal. Let's establish regulations that assure that that is never going to happen. That's essentially what we've done in healthcare. And it's not the fault of either party, either ideology, or centralizers, decentralized. They've all agreed to do these things. Now exactly how is a topic for a longer discussion, and that's exactly what we're working on at Mercatus to explain. So what I'd like to see is better health for more people, lower cost on a continuous basis. Question is, how do you get there? Okay, What are these prohibitions that prevent a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs from occurring in healthcare? Well, first of all, we have structured at the federal level, at the state level, and at the business level, we've structured it all to be an insider's game. The biggest offender is the Medicare reimbursement system, which was really established in 1965. It was greatly updated in the early 1980s with the DRG system, resource groups, and reference groups. I forget what it stands for. Anyway, I'll give you a little anecdote. I saw a doctor speak in Washington, a urologist from Atlanta, a couple years ago. She had a patient with a bladder problem, 2 treatments available, one $60,000, one $2,000. For most patients, the $60,000 is a little bit better, not a whole lot better, but somewhat. But if someone else is paying for it, you'll say, give me the $60,000 anytime. She had a patient who was unusual, just an unusual physiology, so the $2,000 one actually was medically superior for him. And so she said, this is a no-brainer. So she said, sent the paperwork to Medicare. I'm going to do the $2,000 procedure. It's better for the patient, and it's cheap. It'll save you $58,000. Medicare writes back, sorry, we don't pay for that. We will pay for the $60,000. We will not pay for the $2,000 because that's what our computer says. That's what our experts say. And she goes back and forth and back and forth. She happened to say, she said, I hate insurance companies, but after about 4 or 5 conversations, I can get what I need. With Medicare, I can never get it. I don't know. About a year later, I wrote her and said, what happened? She said, well, I'm happy to say I finally got through to Medicare on that. She said, the bad news is I had to take a day out of my practice, go to Washington, go up and down the halls talking to people before I finally persuaded them to cover the $2,000 one. She said, the problem is, though, they're not going to pay me as much as it costs me to do it, but I'll do it. I won't lose much on each one. But that's a structure, that's the sort of structure that we have built all through our system. And it hurts people and it kills people. So it's not a light problem. Medicaid funding does essentially the same thing. It rewards states that are profligate. It punishes states that are economical in their treatments. General hospitals are generally the most beloved economic organization in a community. Everybody serves on the boards, the local state senator and all of the mayor and all the city officials. It's a point of pride. It's usually the largest employer. But we have essentially the general hospital is an engine of cross subsidies. You can never know what the cost of anything is in a general hospital because one department is subsidizing another. You know, there's no such thing as a $50 aspirin. You see it on your bill, it really doesn't mean anything. What you were being charged for was a big, long series of procedures, and they just wrote the number $50 next to the aspirin because it balances the books. But it doesn't actually mean anything. No one, the patients, the doctors, no one knows what anything costs in a hospital, so you can't really optimize, you can't economize. And again, that means you're taking real resources away from sick people and wasting them. Some states have what are called certificate of need laws. That means if you're looking and saying, you know, there's an old, wheezing, inefficient hospital there, and I know I can build a better one, modern, slick, I can do it. And we do have examples, and a lot of them are overseas, not in Europe, not in Canada, or the usual places that people look to, but in India, Thailand, Costa Rica, Singapore, there are hospitals that just leave ours in the dirt. But you really can't build them here because we have restrictions that prevent you from doing the way they do it. Certificate of need basically means that you're the entrepreneur who wants to start a lean, mean, efficient hospital. You have to go and ask for permission from the state to start a competing hospital. And you're asking the people who are serving on the board of directors of the big general hospital, may I please compete with you? And they say, no, I don't think we actually need you to compete with us. Thanks anyway, though. We have state mandates that say your insurance policy has to cover this, and this. Those things are expensive. We have insider games with occupational licensing. Things that a nurse practitioner or a pharmacist can do just fine, maybe even better than a doctor. Nevertheless, our licensing requirements say you've got to have the doctor on premises doing this. And malpractice. Malpractice is, this is where I think it really matters. With malpractice, you discourage people from innovating, from coming up with new things. And I'll tell you a story on that in just a moment. The other thing, and this has a lot to do with that tax equalization problem and the mistake we made back in the 1940s and ever since, we have established walls rather than fences in health insurance. Okay, think of just about every good you buy, your telephone, your car, your lawn service, you name it. There's always a motive to lean over the fence and ask your next door neighbor, where'd you buy that? I'm not happy with the one I have. I'd like to change. Do you have any recommendations? Health insurance is the one thing that no one in America has any motive to lean over a fence and ask your neighbor. Your neighbor doesn't know what policy is available to you. You can't get the same policy your neighbor gets, and vice versa. So it's something that is never talked about. The very thing that makes a competitive market work is utterly and totally absent from health insurance. There is no cross-current of information through an informal network of people just chatting, which is how everything else works in the economy. We've divided into Medicare and Medicaid and CHIP and TRICARE, individual policies, and different small group for every employer, different large group for employer, the VA, the Indian Health Service, you name it. We have built walls so there's no point in talking to anyone about it. We don't share information. Markets cannot function that way. And so I think an important part as we look forward is to think, how can we break down the walls and put up fences so you'll have a motive to share information, to learn things from your neighbor. I'll tell you an anecdote about that, about the malpractice part, and actually several of these items. I'm from a small town in Southern Virginia. The last important thing that happened there was a Civil War battle 150 years ago. Since then, that's been about it in my hometown. We had a family doctor, grew up with my mother there, and he was kind of a colorful character, interesting guy, a little bit eccentric, and a brilliant diagnostician. One day my father was talking to me about him, and he said, well, you know, he basically, the doctor's name was Milton Endy. I recently wrote an article in USA Today about him. He said, you know, he basically invented the idea of stem cell therapy. And I kind of, yeah, right. So, you know, my parents always kind of like to build up their friends' reputation. Well, he did. I learned that about 20 years later. In fact, he did, and performed the world's first cord blood transplant, stem cell transplant in our little hospital in Petersburg, Virginia, where nothing has happened in 150 years. And this was actually the early 1960s. The doctor had an epiphany in the shower, I believe. He said, I've never seen infants with cancer. Why is that? And he gets out and calls his brother, who was also an MD, and said, I'm thinking maybe there's something in the infant's blood, something we don't know about, but maybe that's a cancer inhibitor. So they talked and they came up with the idea of an experiment. Let's take some of my doomed patients who are 100% certain to die, and let's ask them if we can try something. He said, we're going to put infant blood in them. I said, well, we can't go withdrawing blood from infants, but we can do it out of the discarded umbilical cord or the placenta. And he starts injecting the patients. And lo and behold, they start getting better. They go into remission. Some of them go home. Some of them for lengthy periods of time. They all relapsed and all died. So he didn't save anybody. But clearly he had discovered that there was something going on there. Now, he never got the recognition that he should have. To this day, still hasn't. But nevertheless, he is recognized as the first doctor ever to do this sort of a transplant. But fortunately, during the early 1960s, you could do that. And I've asked a friend who's high in the Obama administration in HHS, one of my former students who's an official there, and I said, would what he did even be possible today? Would any doctor do that? We talked it out, and she said, no, probably not. Be worried about being sued, would be worried about regulations. One big inhibiting factor is he was a lone wolf. He was the practice. Now, because of red tape, administrative burdens, doctors are moving into large practices. No large practice is going to let him do that. They'll say, we don't really need that kind of trouble, just do it by the book and leave it alone. And so there's a question of whether we are shutting off the frontier of what has been the most dynamic, innovative healthcare system in world history. And again, I think the ACA will accelerate the process of closing that door, closing that frontier, but it didn't start with the ACA. This is a process that's been going on for 50 or 60 years of shutting down the possibility of Steve Jobs types coming out of the woodwork and innovating our way out of this, finding new treatments, new ways to do things inexpensively. We have shut it off. I'll give you one more example that I just came across last week or 2 weeks ago, and if you look this up on the web, it is really fascinating. It's a story that CBS News did about a kid, 12-year-old boy, who was born with no fingers on his left hand. So a prosthetic costs about $20,000 to $30,000. And maybe you have a Cadillac insurance plan that would pay for it. Maybe you don't. But whatever, it's extremely expensive. His father decided there must be a better way. So I see a nod. Did you see this? It was a great story. So the father goes on the web and hunts around for, I think, a couple of years. And he finally finds some guy, literally in a garage in Washington State, collaborating by internet with some guy in South Africa whom I believe had cut off his fingers in a woodworking accident, and decided to make this his life's work. And using 3D printers, created a design for a workable, functioning prosthetic. Made of plastic, just printed out on a printer. So a printer costs about $2,000. Printing a workable hand costs about $5. And they were showing the kid can pick up a bottle, he can ride his bike, he can pick up his book bag. They showed, I don't think it was the same kid, they showed someone else picking up a coin with it. It was staggering. And as they're saying, it's a $5 hand, not $20,000, $30,000. That's disruptive innovation. And the question is there any insurance policy in America that would pay for that $5 hand? They might well pay for a $20,000 prosthetic, but I doubt that you'll find one that will cover the cost of a $5 hand. And the $5 hand in some ways it's worse, in some ways it's better than the $20,000 one. You can break it pretty easily, but on the other hand, as he notes, if you lose it, if you break it, if you outgrow it, get another $5 and print another one. And furthermore, people are using these things in the way you use your cell phone. They're developing apps. So this father and his son were working on, okay, we could improve it slightly by doing this, and they pass it around on the internet, and little by little, people in their garages, tinkerers, come up with better ways of doing this. And over time, they begin to improve it to the point that just like the first Macs were pretty lousy compared with the mainframe. Now an iPhone's better than the biggest mainframe from 30 years ago. Similarly, these hands may not do everything that the $20,000, $30,000 one does, but if they're allowed to flourish, they're going to be better. That's disruptive innovation, and that's what the system needs. And again, the question that we're going to be focusing on is Mercatus. How do you get that? How do you get from here to there? When I look at the debate over the last 5-10 years here in Capitol Hill, it's focused almost entirely on health insurance. Now, to me, it's somewhat equivalent to saying if you're looking at your household finances, spending all your time debating over should we pay cash or should we use a credit card. It's an important question. It does change behavior. You'll function differently if you use cash versus credit card, so it's not trivial. But the real important question is, what are you buying? What are you buying with your cash? What are you buying with your credit card? That's the real question to focus on. And the healthcare debate here has been, should we use cash or credit? Not what are we buying? And if you want to break down the barriers across the aisles here, which is a tough thing to do in this town, you start focusing on that. The interesting thing is I've written some articles which are in your packet there, and I've gotten a bunch of letters, emails from innovators who arguably are the closest thing we have to a Steve Jobs. And I'll admit, I kind of go there and type their name and look at political contributions. And it's funny, they come from across the spectrum, but the majority have been have been on the left, and they're very intrigued by this idea of how you get to that. It's an issue that cuts across the ideological lines. So, how do you get there? And part of it has to be, and this is a jab at the decentralizers because it's a question they don't take seriously enough. How do you deal with people with pre-existing conditions? If the decentralizers don't answer that question, and they haven't, well, then they're not going to come up with a persuasive argument for the American people. So I think that is their challenge and something that has to be dealt with. Part of my answer is you make things so inexpensive, you allow innovation to the extent that things get cheap enough that it isn't such a problem to afford to serve everyone well. We have not been doing that for the last 50 years. So where are we now? I honestly think the ACA, and we can talk about it if you like, I think it's going up in smoke despite the cheerful news that they've attempted to put out in the last week. I think the website is the least of its problems. The rest of the workings has always been a problem. But I'll say that the people who oppose it have not yet exhibited a vision that's particularly persuasive, that's something that people can get thrilled about. And unless the decentralizers learn to acquire a passion and inspire a passion in healthcare, they're not going to win the arguments. So is this a good time to be starting a healthcare policy program? I like to think of a quote from Winston Churchill that he said early in World War II. After a pivotal moment, he said, "This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. It is perhaps the end of the beginning." That's where I think we are in healthcare, which is why I think it's the most exciting time imaginable to begin a program like this. Thanks much, and we can head into some Q&A.